Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Garrett Graff. I'm the Director of Cyber Initiatives for the Aspen Institute. And welcome to this conversation today about voting in a pandemic election this fall. We were already headed toward what was going to be a complex and controversial election, one that faced unprecedented cybersecurity and information threats from abroad, as well as years of heated and conspiratorial rhetoric here in the United States that is leading voters to question the validity and process of how our democracy chooses its winners and losers on election day. And of course, that was all before we faced this spring an even more unprecedented economic and health disaster with the COVID-19 pandemic, the loss of 40 million jobs, and a partisan environment so vitriolic that it has turned abiding by social distancing requirements and public health recommendations like masks into a political litmus test as fraught as abortion or immigration. So how do we carry on this fall an election that is secure, trusted, and safe? We're going to spend some time today talking about each of those values and the potential conflicts between them. And I'm joined today by three great panelists. Kim Wyman, the Secretary of State for the state of Washington, which has been a leader on voting innovation, and much of it coming from Secretary Wyman herself, who has been the Secretary of State since 2012, as well as Dale Ho, the director of the Voting Rights Project at the ACLU, who has been at the forefront of some of the pressing and important legal battles this year over how we vote and when we vote in a pandemic. And then lastly, Ben Adida, the executive director of Voting Works, a software engineer himself who is working to ensure that we take every technological advantage that we can as we head into this fall's election. He is also the only one of our panel today who has actually built his own voting system, the Helios voting system, which is available for online elections. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that meant and what principles he brought into that process. So with that, I want to welcome our panelists, and we are meeting today on a Tuesday, a primary day in multiple jurisdictions around the country, and particularly in Georgia today, which has had a very fraught history in recent years with its voting process and the integrity of its election systems and voting rolls. So I wanted to sort of kick things off this today by asking Dale what he is seeing play out in Georgia today, and what it means for where we are in this election year and what we should be paying attention to heading into the fall. So Dale, Georgia.
Well, we're already seeing, thank you, Garrett, for that question, and it's a pleasure to be a part of today's panel, I should say. We're already seeing reports of extremely long lines in numerous locations in Georgia. And you know, I think we're going to have to wait and see to find out exactly what the precise causes of these problems are. But what we're seeing isn't inconsistent with problems we've seen in other states during primaries this spring. Voter interest is very high, and that can obviously sometimes lead to long lines. But in particular, right now, trying to conduct an in-person election during the pandemic has proven to be quite a challenge. Many jurisdictions are experiencing poll worker shortages. In the 2016 presidential election, for example, over half of poll workers were over the age of 60, which, you know, is exactly the age group that is most at risk of severe complications from COVID exposure. So there are poll worker shortages. And then a lot of locations normally used for polling sites can't be used right now. Schools are closed, churches are closed, places like senior centers really don't want to be open to large crowds, quite understandably, right now. So we've seen a lot of consolidations. Ohio, for example, for its primary election, had to close 150 polling locations across the state before canceling its primary altogether and moving to a largely vote by mail system. So we know that we're going to have problems with more voters assigned per polling location than ever. And we're having to cope with that in the midst of a pandemic when public health officials are recommending that we not congregate in large groups. It's quite a challenge.
Secretary Wyman, you have worked on this issue for many, many years. You have a background in election administration prior to coming in as a Secretary of State, which gives you a rare background nationwide as a top election official. And I'm curious if you could, why are elections so hard for the United States to get right? We are 20 years after the Hanging Chads debacle of Florida. It still seems like every 2 years when elections come around, we're surprised at the problems that our election infrastructure can't handle. We still face long lines. This problem sort of seems to uniquely hit the sort of fall between the cracks of the American federalism system between federal, state, and local officials. And I'm wondering if you could just sort of talk about, from your perspective, why this issue is just so hard for America to get right.
Well, I think it's the perfect storm of a whole bunch of things in 2020, but it's been long in the making. Let's start by just giving that long range view. If you think about it, in 1960 for the presidential race, 60 million ballots were cast. In 2016, over 100 and, I should have looked it up, 150 million, 135 million, there we go, ballots were cast in that election. And I point that out because I think it has been incremental over the course of my lifetime, certainly, that just the eligible voter population has expanded. It started with the Voting Rights Act in 1965. It further was expanded with the National Voter Registration Act in 1993. And then, of course, the Help America Vote Act in 2003, 2002, whichever it was. And I think that we continue to view our elections with that 1960 view. It's a neighborhood gathering where everyone comes together at our polling place and we get ballots from our neighbors and we vote and we all go on. And our lives aren't that anymore. In 1960, Dad went off to work and voted on his way to his office, and Mom, when the kids were in school, went to the polling place. That is just not the American lifestyle right now. And then we've added all sorts of things to expand access and security, for that matter. All of these things now are coming together, and you're really seeing the gaping holes in our system when you can no longer have it be a social interaction between a poll worker and a voter, between someone at the voting center and a voter, because of this pandemic. And I think that it's shining this bright light on the holes that are in our system in terms of access. And we can't just fix them overnight, because we need to build in the compensating security to inspire a sense of confidence in the public. So it's going to be a heavy lift in 2020. It already was with cybersecurity.
So for all of you who are joining us, I would encourage you to put questions into the chat or the formal Q&A system at the bottom of your screen. Please add your name and affiliation if you are comfortable, but it's certainly not necessary. We'll be turning to questions throughout this hour, as well as hearing from the panelists. So Ben, let me start. This is a question that I actually want to then put to all three of you, which is what are the sort of operational and security concerns that most worry you heading into the fall election, based on both the environment that we already knew we were going to face this year coming into it from a security perspective, as well as the sort of added layer of the pandemic playing out over the course of the fall. So Ben, your thoughts?
Let's try to unmute. Yeah, the key thing, I want to emphasize what Dale mentioned, which is there's a disruption that this year is bringing to in-person voting, right? With the poll workers, a lot of poll workers being concerned about the number of voters they're going to be in contact with, right? I think there was an estimate that a typical poll worker will be in touch with about 700 voters in a given day. And a lot of poll workers are elderly. So I think that's where it starts. But when you think about the dynamic, this year that there's going to be a significant move to vote by mail. That's just what we've seen in Wisconsin, which went in 2016 from 10% vote by mail to 70% vote by mail in 2020 for the same primary, right? Just the primary numbers. And that was 3 weeks into the pandemic, right? With, as we know, a lot of issues around people requesting their ballot in time and getting their ballot in time. So we're going to see this trend across the country. And the one thing that I always emphasize in all of these conversations is that election officials do unbelievably heroic work to get elections done year after year. And it's not even just years, so it's so many elections that happen in any given year. But this year, the challenge that is unique is how quickly things are moving, right? How quickly things are moving in a way that I don't think election officials have ever faced, right? So in states like the state of Washington, Secretary Wyman's state, where there's already full vote by mail, this disruption is not as harsh as it might be in some other states, which are going from very low vote by mail to very high percentage vote by mail. And it's the speed of that change that's on my mind, and that I want, that my organization, Voting Works, is working to address. The key things I would, when people think about vote by mail, they think about, just put a freaking ballot in the envelope and send it. Like, how hard can this be, right? Like, put a stamp on it. There's a lot more to it than that, as I'm sure Secretary Wyman can get into and knows better than I. The three things I'll mention, and again, I'm sure Secretary Wyman will add more to this, getting the right ballot promptly to the voter is not that easy, right? There are different ballot styles. There are different, you have to get it out in time. You have to get it out 45 days before the election. So that's challenge number one. Challenge number two is giving voters confidence that their ballot actually was made it, right? Like when they return it. And so that's tracking the ballot, giving them a sense that it actually made it into the tally. And challenge number three is prompt tabulation. Now, when you've had years like Secretary Wyman to prepare, that is, you can get the high-speed scanners, you can do all of that. But if you're moving very rapidly from an in-precinct voting model to a more of a central count voting model, now you have scanners that were designed for the precinct, which tend to be slow, single feed ballot scanners. And now you need to move to high-speed scanners, or you need to hire an army of people to feed those ballots into those scanners. And that's going to take a very long time. And we've seen that in the primaries recently. So those are the three things that I'm worried about: getting the right ballot promptly to voters, giving voters a means to track the ballot when it comes back, and tabulating those ballots promptly.
Dale, what's your view of what the operational and technical challenges that you're most concerned about as we head into this fall?
Well, as Ben noted, voting by mail is a complicated system to try to implement, overnight. And I think what a lot of people maybe don't fully understand is that we're talking about a spectrum of different systems. It's not like there's vote by mail and then there's voting in person, and those are just the two categories that states fall into. You have sort of at one end of the spectrum, states like Secretary Wyman's Washington and Colorado and Utah, Hawaii, Oregon, that have almost all voting conducted via mail. That's 5 states. Then you have another 28 states that permit all voters to vote absentee. Every eligible voter can vote by mail, but voters aren't sort of affirmatively provided ballots. And those states vary pretty substantially in terms of the number or percentage of voters who actually take advantage of that system as opposed to voting in person. And then you have 17 states that right now, by law, do not permit every eligible voter to vote by mail. And a number of those states, I think at last count 14, have made moves to permit that for the primaries, although they haven't made the same commitment for the general election. And I guess, what I think people need to understand is that as we try to expand access to voting by mail, we're not trying to get everyone over to Washington or Oregon. What we're trying to do is nudge states along that spectrum closer to that ideal so that there are more opportunities to vote by mail. Because what we don't want to see is, a state, go from an excuse required and that has very little voting by mail, and then try to adopt something like a Washington or Oregon model, over the course of a few months. I think we all understand that that would be quite challenging. That's number one. And then number two, I think what we also want to make sure is that the public understands, and media organizations have a huge role to play in this, that elections where ballots are cast in large numbers by mail tend to take longer to tabulate. There are a number of states that don't allow for the processing of ballots until election day, or even until after the polls close. Some of those states are states that only recently adopted no excuse absentee voting. Michigan is one, Pennsylvania is another. And just to give you a sense about how significant a change that is in terms of the volume of ballots that are going to come in by mail, I think Pennsylvania saw about an 18-fold increase in requests to vote by mail between the 2016 primary and this year. So that's a lot more ballots to tabulate through that slower process of counting absentee ballots. And if the election is close, it means it may be difficult to forecast a winner on election night. And what people, I think, need to understand is that's not actually a problem. That's how the system is supposed to work, but it's more important to get the result right than to get a fast result. And so I guess one thing that I am concerned about is that if those election results do trickle in, particularly in those states that were pivotal in the presidential election in 2016, like Michigan and Pennsylvania, you may get some, unfounded, statements from some quarters that this, the pace at which the results are being tabulated suggests some kind of problem. And that's not the case.
Secretary Wyman, I want to come back to you in a second and ask you to walk us through what is sort of the actual operational challenge of running a vote by mail election. But let me just keep on the specific question here first of what are you most concerned about heading into this fall?
Well, I think that Ben and Dale both did a great job of framing some of my main concerns. I think probably the biggest one beyond just the impact of 60-year-olds not being able to work, which really does make up at least half of our workforce, if not 2/3 of our workforce. It affects all 50 states. Even Washington, this is going to be a major recruitment effort across our state because we have about the same number of employees that work on the backside of an election to process ballots and produce those results. So even though we don't have polling places per se, we have same-day voter registration. So we will have vote centers open, at least one in each of our 39 counties on election day, and those will still have all of the challenges that any polling place will have, issuing replacement ballots, registering voters, and issuing ballots for the first time. So those things keep me up at night. I think that the thing that probably worries me most on a national level is Washington State had about a 30-year evolution from polling place voting to full vote by mail. And I say that because I look over, you know, from 1993 when we were just first opening up permanent absentee status, where a voter could choose to get a ballot every mail. We went from about, I'd say, 10% of our electorate who had an absentee ballot sent to them every election to, you know, by the late 90s, 60%. And we had the closest governor's race in the country's history in 2004. So everything that Dale said, I just started having a little bit of PTS because you're exactly right. And what happens when you move to a vote by mail environment or even expand absentee voting, it slows down tabulation. He was spot on in that assessment. And what that means is it takes longer to get results. Even in Washington, where we've had a full decade to get all of our counties in a full vote by mail environment and get all of the processing in place, we still don't know election results really until Thursday or Friday of election week. And that's because we're a postmark state, meaning that as long as the ballot has a postmark of election day or before, it's counted. This is going to happen across the country. And I think the thing, if I wanted to typify what my biggest concern is for the fall election, is election administrators' job is to convince the losers that they lost. And right now, as we sit here in June 2020, I guarantee you that half of the country cannot conceive that Republicans could win in November. The other half of the country cannot conceive that Democrats can win. So in that environment, and you're already starting to see it with lawsuits, you're seeing it with vitriol on Twitter, you're seeing it you know, across the spectrum, people are already starting to talk in terms of voter fraud and voter suppression. And these are things that the left and right have used for decades to talk about the things that needed to be improved in elections. And that's the environment that election officials have to operate in and convince that side that believes there's rampant fraud or believes that there were efforts to suppress certain voting blocks, that those things didn't happen because of the safeguards we have in place. That's what keeps me up at night.
Sticking with you, Secretary Wyman, can you walk us through, because I think much of America is waking up right now over the course of 2020 to the complications of vote by mail. Can you talk about both the sort of front end challenges of implementing vote by mail? One of the things that I was surprised by learning about this issue this year is how few vendors there actually are to print the approved ballots, that there's sort of almost a Kinko's problem at the front end, that, you know, America will be challenged to even print as many ballots as we may want this fall for vote by mail. And then on the back end, sort of how you see what the operational considerations, for instance, of how you authenticate a vote by mail ballot on the back end.
Sure. Okay, I am unmuted. So in the if you take a step back and look at our elections, remember I mentioned that polling place model that dates back to the 1950s at least. That model really has evolved in our state, and I'll use our state as an example because I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from Oregon and Washington in particular. First of all, absentee balloting is something that the voter is choosing to ask for. I don't want to vote at the polls, or I can't vote at the polls. I'd like you to send me a ballot to my home and I'll vote at home. And so that was the evolution that Washington first had between about 1993 to 2004, is that we allowed any voter to be able to be a permanent absentee voter, meaning they got a ballot every election. And over the course of that, 11 years or so, what we saw was our counties really had to retool our operations to be able to do a full poll site election, anticipating any of those voters could show up on election day and be able to provide a ballot to each one of those 60% of our voters who requested one every election. What we found in 2004 is you can't do both well. And that really came to light across the country when, if any of you were following our election, we had an election where 2.7 million ballots were cast. And after 2 recounts and a court case, it was separated by 133 votes. When you go through that type of election, like Gore v. Bush, every little error that's made is just on the front page of every newspaper and the lead story of every newscast. And people became aware of CHADs. Well, in our state, people became aware of provisional ballots. They became aware of poor internal controls, quite honestly, both at the polling place and in absentees, of not even knowing how many absentee ballots they had in their possession. So out of that was when our legislature decided to move and let counties move to vote by mail. So in the next 11 years, counties were able to really retool their operations and now can not only reconcile down to every single ballot that they received, they can tell a voter when it was received, if it was counted, or whether it was rejected. Voters have a lot of abilities to do those checks themselves and verify it. We actually, the biggest security measure we have in place is that we check the signature on every return envelope against that signature on file. We have voter ID and have had it since 2006 in Washington State. So all of these things go together to balance out that wide access that vote by mail causes, because vote by mail is something that election officials are proactively sending the voter a ballot. And that's the real difference between, absentee balloting and vote by mail. And I think that's why it's getting the visceral reaction that we're seeing in partisans, where you have Republicans railing against, railing against vote by mail. Well, they don't like the fact that everybody's going to get a ballot sent to them, even if they don't want it. And I think on the Democratic side, to be bipartisan, I think that's why you have that railing against absentee vote balloting. The voter shouldn't have to take action. They should just be able to be allowed to vote. And both sides are right and both sides are wrong in some of their arguments. And what we really have to focus on is how do we balance out security and access in a way that it mitigates that. So those criticisms coming from the White House, I have to be able to answer his base why our elections are secure. And when the criticisms come from the left and members of Congress say that vote by mail isn't accessible for a voting group, I have to be able to address that too as an election official. So that's really the goal I think that our country needs to be reaching towards is balancing access and security in a way that it inspires confidence.
Ben, you've talked about in the past the sort of systemic challenge that we face with our voting system, that voting machines are too often insecure, they're not particularly easy to use, they're expensive, they're used for longer than they are intended, which means that you can find, voting authorities trying to find used parts on eBay. And you've spoken about this really as a national market failure in voting technology. How do we fix this? And what are the hallmarks of a trusted and secure and safe voting system that we should be looking for as a country?
Yeah, I'm excited to try to tell you that without taking over the rest of the time that we have in this Zoom. If I can make one point, you said something really important, Garrett, in the previous question to Secretary Wyman, and then I'll get to this question. You talked about printing and mailing enough ballots as the demand for vote by mail increases. And again, I don't think this is anything the state of Washington has to deal with because you've spent all this time ramping up and building all of that capacity. But I think that's a really important point that we're not talking about enough, which is the data seems to show that the capacity is severely it's not limited. It's grown quite a bit given the demand, but the demand is outstripping the capacity. And so there's some very actionable things that people can do here. If you're a voter in a state where you have not voted by mail before and you're thinking of voting by mail this year, I want to urge you to make your absentee ballot request now. Make it as soon as you can so that election officials can see the demand coming. And if you're an election official in a county where you have not historically had a high proportion of vote by mail, start planning now. Call your vendor. And by the way, I'll make a small pitch and then I'll get back to broader principles. If you do call your vendor and you find out that they don't have the capacity, then give us a call at Voting Works, because we're working on a solution to help you fill that right now. That's it. That's my little pitch, and then I'll get back to the broad principles. But specifically, we're working on adding capacity to the system and helping people rapidly ramp up vote by mail, because it's going to have to happen one way or another. Now, to the points you mentioned, you talked about, what makes, what do you want in a voting system? And what has caused the kind of systemic failure or market failure in the last 20 plus years. What you want in a voting system, there's three key things that I think you want to have. One, you want paper ballots that voters can verify directly. They can look at the paper, they can feel the paper ideally, and see their vote, right? Like, this is critical, because this is how everyone can verify that their vote was correctly recorded. And there is a long debate around hand marked versus machine marked, and I won't get into it right now, but the one thing everybody agrees on is that paper ballot that you look at and make sure that it reflects the vote that you have. The second thing you want, and the really good news, by the way, about paper ballots is this movement towards paper ballots has been very successful over the last 20 years, right? So you see an overwhelming majority of states are already on voter verifiable paper ballots, or they're getting there, right? And this year, I think, will be the highest we've been in a long time on paper ballots. The second thing you want is, when you tabulate those paper ballots, you want confidence that that tabulation was done properly. And this is something where there's still some emerging work happening, but this year, I think it's going to be very exciting. This year, we're going to see a lot more risk limiting audits. And these are audits that are happening on the tabulators, on the back end, that election officials can run to make sure the scanners did their job. One way to think about it is, it is a very rapid way to check that the result would be the same if you did a full hand recount, right? But you can do it much more quickly and much more cheaply than a full hand recount. And so you see states like Michigan looking at this. Colorado was the first, and is the one state that has been doing these statewide audits for the last few years, and they're really leaders on this, and it's fantastic. You see states like Michigan, Rhode Island, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and a number of other states that are looking at doing this year. And so we're likely to have a lot more evidence this year that the election was carried out well, which I think is critical, especially in this hyper-partisan situation that we're in. We're gonna want more data. We're gonna want more evidence that things were tabulated correctly. And then the third thing I will mention, so one, paper ballots, two, risk-limiting audits. The third thing that, even when we care about this, we forget too often, accessibility. We need to think about how to give voters of all abilities access to the secret ballot. And this is not just a handful of voters, that make things inconvenient, right? There's a gradient. There's a whole spectrum of disabilities, and actually, most of us, as we get older, will hit some amount of disability at some point in our lives. So when we talk about allowing voters with disabilities access to the secret ballot, it's a huge civil rights issue that we have to think about in every system that we employ. Those are the three things I'd focus on. If I speak longer, if I add more, it'll take the rest of the time. So I'll pause here.
Thanks, Ben. Dale, Ben just mentioned some of the success stories that we're seeing around the country in terms of jurisdictions that are doing this well and the lessons that they're learning. You're operating a lot on the other end of the spectrum, in courtrooms, trying to defend the right of people to vote in jurisdictions that, from the ACLU's perspective, are not honoring their commitment to a free and open election. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of the other end of this spectrum and where you are seeing areas of concern from policymakers limiting access this fall.
Well, thanks. But, I'm happy to address that. I should just say initially that I'm generally pleased with how elections administrators at the state and local level, leaving aside sort of the rhetoric that we're seeing coming out of Washington, D.C., the actual response from local and state elections administrators across the political spectrum has been to increase access, I think appropriately, during the pandemic. I mentioned earlier there were 17 states that normally by law do not permit every eligible voter to vote by mail. Of those 17, 13 have agreed to do that during their primaries. They haven't all made the same commitment for their general, but that's great. And those states include states across the political spectrum, states like Connecticut, but also states like West Virginia and Indiana and Kentucky, even Alabama. So I'm generally pleased with how elections administrators are operating. I will say though, and to your point, that not everyone is doing everything they can to make sure that everyone can vote safely during the pandemic. And we've brought a number of lawsuits, first on the eligibility question, against states like Tennessee and Texas that don't allow every eligible voter to vote by mail, South Carolina and Missouri, which didn't do that until we sued them and passed legislation in response to those lawsuits to then extend that eligibility to everyone else. But then also I'm seeing some sort of knee-jerk preservation of security measures, so-called security measures, which actually do nothing to enhance the security of absentee voting. And I'll just give you one example. There are 11 states that require someone to get a witness to sign their absentee ballot or to have their ballot notarized. And it really serves no useful function. And yet, even in states like South Carolina, where the chief elections administrator of the state, Marcy Andino, who's the executive director of the Elections Commission, asked the legislature to eliminate the requirement because those witness signatures have never once been used in any way by elections administrators in the state. And because the signature itself is usually illegible and not accompanied by any identifying information that would allow elections administrators to use those signatures. The legislature considered it and then ultimately said, you know, we just don't want to remove that feature because it makes us feel more secure, even though it serves no actual function in terms of elections administration, and in fact would require voters to violate the very social distancing protocols that public health officials are asking them to respect right now. So we had to sue over that. We've sued over similar requirements in other states. At the end of the day, I think we just need to use common sense when it comes to making sure that voters can vote without violating the public health guidelines that we're all being asked to adhere to protect our own health and that of our communities.
For those of you watching along at home or wherever you are today, feel free to add in questions in the Q&A in the chat. We're going to be using those throughout the remaining 20 minutes or so of the conversation here. And for those of you at home, just to give you a sneak peek behind the scenes here, when Dale was talking about notarized signatures, Secretary Wyman's eyes rolled so far back in her head that she barely stayed on the screen. This does get Secretary Wyman, though, to some of the rhetoric that we're hearing a lot about vote by mail, which is, you know, some version of, you know, there's going to be rampant voter fraud with these mail-in ballots, and or the U.S. Postal Service is going to steal all of the ballots or misdeliver them or lose them along the way. None of that has been Washington State's experience. I think I've seen you talk that you found fraud in something like 142 out of 3.2 million votes in the most recent Washington election. So I wonder if you could talk to just what are the legitimate security concerns and how much should people be worried about the security of a vote by mail election?
Well, I think there's some real things that need to happen, and this is what's going to be the challenge for those states that have to ramp up in a matter of months rather than a matter of years. First and foremost, you have to have some sort of robust, up-to-date voter registration system, and that needs to be statewide. And Washington, because we've been vote by mail for so long, and our members of the ERIC consortium of 30 states that are doing data matching on a regular basis of our voter registration lists. Washington has a very clean, if you will, voter registration list because we do robust maintenance. We are contacting voters who move to our state and give them opportunities to vote. And we're also updating address changes that occur when people move within the state and move across the lines. And why this is significant this fall is if your list is out of date, you're going to be mailing ballots to voters that don't live in those addresses any longer. And that's probably the biggest complaint that I get from particularly people in the Republican Party is, my son and daughter haven't lived in our house in 30 years and they're still getting their ballots, and then when you do the kind of deep dive, well, they never told us they moved. So, we're at a loss here, but it's about instilling confidence in people. So it's all of those little steps that you take. So first of all, 10% of our population across the country moves every year. And that tends to be younger voters. So you have to be very diligent in doing those cleanup mailings, the annual or biannual NBRA mailing, for example. So you have clean lists to start with. But at this point, they either have them or they don't, and you can't move forward without a clean list. So we're just going to go past. But that's the first issue. Second issue is, what are you verifying those ballots with? In our state, it is a voter signature. When the voter fills out their voter registration form or registers to vote at Department of Licensing, that signature is on file. We have trained people who are trained annually by our state patrol to verify those signatures. And surprisingly, most people's signatures don't change very much over their life. With that said, if a signature doesn't match, one of the really important access controls we have in place is we contact the voter during that voting period or the certification period after Election Day. Give them an opportunity to update their signature and make it valid. That does a secondary security check, because if I mailed you a ballot, Garrett, and or I send you this letter and you get it and you say, I haven't voted yet, I guarantee you're going to call your election official right away and let them know there's potentially fraud. And then finally, it's about reconciliation. You have to have very good internal controls on the back end and throughout that whole process of your mailed out ballots to the return ballots to make sure that you can account for them. So when people make allegations of, oh, well, we know people sat in a room at the XYZ organization and filled out ballots and they just stuffed the ballot box, we can show exactly how many ballots were issued, how many were returned, how many were rejected, and why. And you have to do that, or else you'll find trays of ballots after Election Day that will be completely valid, and it's just an administrative error. And I guarantee you, those will be the source of many, many lawsuits. I think in the Rossi Gregoire 2004 election, the state of Washington was sued, I think, 12 times. Over those types of things. And what was great is it just depended on who was winning or losing. So the Democrats and Republicans had an equal number of lawsuits, and their arguments would change when their totals changed. So it's weird. Internal controls are important.
We've talked a lot about the sort of technical limitations, the technical security concerns coming into this election. I want to spend a little bit of time, though, talking about the information environment that we're going to see over the course of this election, both before the election and after the election, particularly if there is, for legitimate or illegitimate reasons, concerns about the validity of the election results. And I wonder, Dale, if you could sort of talk a little bit about, first, what are the responsible messages that you would hope that the media would be sharing in the run-up to the election?
Well, I hope the media, doesn't give voice to what I believe, and I think any fair observer understands, are baseless assertions about the insecurity of systems where people can vote by mail, right? We've heard really, really kind of crazy rhetoric coming out of the White House, also the Attorney General, you know, by his own admission, saying he has no reason to think that something like this would happen, but then kind of speculating that some foreign government might send a batch of uh, 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 fraudulent absentee ballots to a state. And I'm sure Secretary Wyman can explain why something like that would never, ever be successful in a state like Washington. So I think that's really, really important, that we don't sort of both sides this debate about whether or not voting by mail is safe and secure. I mean, before the pandemic really, really hit, you had the RNC sending out mailers in Pennsylvania urging Republicans in Pennsylvania to vote by mail and describing it as, quote, safe, easy, and secure, right? So this really shouldn't be a partisan issue, that voting by mail works. We have to be responsible about how we expand it. We shouldn't get over our skis, so to speak, on the issue and try to do too much. But when the alternative is, something like Wisconsin, something like what we're seeing in Georgia right now, where we don't process enough voters before Election Day, either through safe early in-person voting or through robust opportunities to vote by mail, we're going to see problems on Election Day, and that is bad for confidence as well. The other thing that I just want to say about the information environment, since you referenced it, is there is a dearth of information out there for people about how to vote by mail. And I'm not talking about states like Washington, where everyone's, familiar with the system and has been doing it. But as I noted earlier, we have this kind of spectrum of practices across the country and 50 different systems in terms of not just who's eligible to vote by mail, but how you get your ballot if you need to request it at all. Whether you need to do that on paper or online, what deadline you need to do that by, and then again, what deadline you need to return that ballot. So 50 different systems. It makes creating a clean information environment difficult because there are so many different systems and different rules under each system. Even in states that have allowed no excuse absentee voting for years, in the vast majority of those states, most voters have never voted by mail and have always voted in person, and many of them are now going to want to vote by mail. So it's really critical that in each of those states that's making adjustments to their voting by mail systems and making them more expansive, that there's robust public education to accompany those efforts so that everyone just knows what the rules of the game are.
Secretary Wyman, I might put the same question to you and then to Ben next, which is, how do we speak well and responsibly about this election in the run-up to it, knowing that there are actually sort of national security concerns around actors, both foreign and domestic, who have a vested interest in leading Americans to question the sanctity of their democracy?
Well, one of the things I think has been an unintended benefit from all of the cybersecurity ramp up that we've been doing since 2016 as a country, with the election sector becoming critical infrastructure and all of that the work that's been done in every one of the states across our country, is that we now are communicating in ways we couldn't have done 4 years ago, even probably 2 years ago. So I think that the information that election officials have been able to share with each other on, how do you ramp up absentee ballots, how do you move to vote by mail, and some of those mechanical things, we're able to get that information to each other far more efficiently, and I think are having really robust discussions that are going to be a net positive for our country and for our voters. I do agree that we have to focus on the messaging of empowering the voter, and like, I can't remember who said it, but right now, check your voter registration address. right now, apply for your absentee ballot if you have to apply for one. Right now, do those things as a voter to make sure that you're going to get a ballot and be able to vote. And if the longer you wait as a voter, the closer to election day, the less options you're going to have, and you're going to end up having to go into a polling place or a voting center and exposing yourself potentially to other people that may have COVID-19. So that's all a positive for election officials too, because if we can get more people to do things in advance, they can plan better. Going back to one of the conversations earlier, we talked about the capacity in the system, and it's not just whether or not there's enough printers to do all the ballots and all the envelopes and all the materials for vote by mail and absentee voting. The problem is that in November, that window is universally the same across the board. And that's really where the capacity piece stretches really thin, is that we all need our ballots for our military overseas voters to be ready to go 45 days before the election. We all have similar voting windows. And how do we build that out? Again, it's planning. And the more that voters can be engaged with that, the better. And then I think on the back end, states need to look right now if they have enough time to process that volume after election day. In Washington State, half of our ballots come in election week. When we're looking at close to 4 million ballots being cast in Washington State, we have to plan for that kind of capacity. And that's what states really need to look at, is what happens if half your ballots come in election week? How are you going to process those? And what does that mean for results? And work with the media so people understand that we will probably not know the president, who is the president-elect on election night. In fact, it may be by the end of November. And if the more we can do that now, then there less will be allegations that there's some sort of ballot stuffing or some manipulation of ballots to affect the outcome.
Secretary Wyman, before I leave you to ask that same question about information for Ben, Charles Berry, one of our viewers today, was asking on your most recent answer, how does the cost of doing a vote by mail election in Washington State compare to the costs that your fellow secretaries of state might bear in a entirely in-person sort of traditional polling operation?
Well, I've never ever tried to sell vote by mail as a less expensive option. It's just a cost shift. You have more printing costs, you have more personnel costs for actual processing of ballots in a centralized location. So it's a cost shift. And I think that's what's going to be a real challenge this fall, is that's not only a cost shift, it's a cost increase for these jurisdictions that still have to provide voting centers or polling places on election day. They are where we were in 2004. You're running two simultaneous elections, and this is one of the reasons why we really need to be pushing on Congress to, one, make sure that they fund the U.S. Postal Service, because if we don't have a delivery by USPS, we are going to have a real problem in November. And then also just additional monies that states are going to need to build in that capacity to not only print, but to process all of those ballots.
Ben, so the previous question now to you, a little bit about, you have a set of voting machines arrayed behind you there. And I'm curious if you can sort of talk about what your information concerns are heading into November.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing I want to say is really double down on what Secretary Wyman just talked about, which is the time it's going to take to tabulate this election, and the fact that we have to be ready for a different election night, a different election week, a different election month. And I think the press, the reporters out there, could play a significant role in getting people ready for that, in normalizing that situation. And when you think about it, it makes sense, because really, if voting day is November 3rd, why shouldn't you be allowed to post your ballot on November 3rd itself, right? Or November 2nd at least, right? And then it's going to take a few days to get there, and then you're going to have to scan them. So I really want to double down on that. I think that's one of the major things on the information side, where there's this idea that, oh, it took a while, there must be fraud. Like, no, it took a while because the ballots had to come in, right? And they had to be counted. So that's point number one. But I would say, you know, as a longtime security engineer, the thing that most folks don't quite understand about security attacks is that it's almost never the Mission Impossible Tom Cruise hanging from the ceiling, hacking into the computer, right? Like, that's not how it works. Attackers tend to be rational, and they tend to go for the low-hanging fruit attack. What's the low-hanging fruit attack in our democracy today? It's fear-mongering. It's information warfare. It's reducing trust in the outcome of the election. It's the, forget actually corrupting the election. It's making people believe that the election didn't go well. And you can do that without ever hacking a voting machine, without ever impersonating a voter, because that's the world we're living in today. So the dominant thing I would say is fear-mongering is the attack. And I hope that the press and reporters can work on understanding that, because they can play unwittingly a role in amplifying that attack. Yeah, I could add a couple more things, but you know, when you look at things like, oh my God, there are dead people on the voter rolls. Well, yes, of course, people die and they don't get cleansed off the voter rolls right away. That's unfortunately how things work. It doesn't mean that that's going to be abused. Rationally speaking, if you want to abuse that, you're still trying to commit a federal crime for one ballot. That just doesn't happen, right? Or it happens so rarely that it doesn't actually matter. If you're worried about that kind of stuff, you should be a lot more worried about the number of people with disabilities that are going to be disenfranchised if we don't provide avenues for them. That's a lot less of a headline, but it's a lot more real, right? So again, information warfare, I think, is the major attack, and we have to be conscious of that.
Yeah. And Ben, you and Secretary Wyman both touched on sort of an area that I spend a lot of time thinking about, you know, which is sort of the broader cybersecurity backdrop of this fall's election. And one of the things that is really interesting and potentially powerful about, you know, extending those early voting periods, extending vote by mail opportunities, is it decreases the chance of sort of the single point of failure of an election day, of, you know, some of what we are seeing in, you know, for instance, Atlanta today, where, you know, people are showing up at polling places where the machines just don't work, or an administrator is locked out of the system, or there's a power outage in a given neighborhood. And that's sort of one of the things that I think is complicated about the voting structure, the voting environment that we have now, is that a certain percentage of that happens every election. It's, you know, you sort of have the, you know, the dog ate my homework equivalent of the day of election problems. But that, you know, until recent elections, those aren't necessarily escalated into national levels of concern, where you're seeing sort of wall-to-wall coverage of people unable to vote. So I think that's one of the, where I might, we're coming up on the hour here, so I might sort of close by giving Dale the last question here. And if you could sort of talk a little bit, Dale, about the work that the ACLU is thinking about and building towards in terms of how are you approaching your own operations on election day? You know, what are you going to be looking for? You know, what types of contingency plans are you building across the country? And how are you going to be sort of thinking about election day itself?
Well, I think just like election administrators' plans have been, for the most part in many states, upended, so have our plans for election protection and monitoring voting rights issues. You know, I think initially our plan had been to observe what happens in the primaries and kind of deploy our on-the-ground presence, you know, accordingly, to try to first make sure that those problems don't get repeated for the general, whether it's, you know, under-resourcing or bad, you know, allocations, not enough polling locations. and then making sure that we're on the ground to respond to problems in real time on election day. Right now, my staff is not traveling around the country. We're having to rejigger our plans pretty significantly. And I'll confess that we've spent most of the last 3 months just kind of drinking from a fire hose, trying to see what we can do to help, advocate for states to expand early voting or get the resources they need from the federal government to have safe in-person voting and the resources they need to process more absentee ballots than ever, and to nudge states along, whether through advocacy or litigation, to either expand eligibility or remove unnecessary obstacles to voting by mail. I'll admit we haven't quite gotten around to figuring out how we're going to do our election day protection efforts in this new environment. If we can't travel, it's going to be a little bit different. But if we see problems like we have seen in Georgia continue to repeat themselves in other states as their primaries stretch through the summer, then we'll formulate a response. I can assure you of that.
Dale, Secretary Wyman, Ben, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been hugely informative for me, and I follow this relatively closely, so I hope that our participants have enjoyed it as well. Thank you all for those of you who joined us. We will be sending around a recording of this later if you care to share, and stay tuned for more from Aspen Digital virtually.